board heard she was at low risk of reoffending. It's a decision that Justice Secretary Dominic Raab has told MPs he's unhappy with.
In light of the Parole Board's direction to release Tracy Connolly, I should inform the House that having carefully read the decision, I've decided to apply to the Parole Board to seek their reconsideration.
Tracy Connolly was charged alongside her boyfriend and his brother. She admitted the offence and was ordered to serve at least 5 years. She has spent around 13 years in prison with a spell out on licence between 2013 and 2015, but she had to go back after breaching her licence conditions. She could now be released for good after the parole board heard she was at low risk of reoffending. This is her 4th parole review. According to a report, at the time of her crimes, Connolly, who was then 25, got into relationships quickly, used sex to help her feel better about herself, and had an inability to control extreme emotions. She was also described as manipulative and lacking in empathy. But now the board says, after considering the circumstances of her offending, the time on licence, the progress she's made whilst in custody, as well as evidence presented to them and recommendations of witnesses, they are satisfied that Ms Connolly is suitable for release. Now, if she is let out, she would be subject to conditions which would be strictly adhered to, which would include staying at a designated address, behaving well. She'll also wear an electronic tag and be required to disclose any relationships she may have, and her internet and phone use would be monitored. A spokesperson has said that parole board decisions are solely focused on what risk a prisoner could represent to the public if they're released and whether that risk is manageable in the community. They say parole reviews are undertaken thoroughly and with extreme care, and protecting the public is our number one priority.
Charlotte Lynch reporting there. Coming up in a moment, it's Cross Question with Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, the journalist, author and political commentator. Chris Daw, QC, is with us, lawyer, legal commentator and author of Justice on Trial, Radical Solutions for a System at Breaking Point. Giles Kenningham is David Cameron's former head of press. He's the founder of Trafalgar Strategy. And Luke Tryl is UK director of More in Common. They're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973. That's the number to call. And you can, of course, watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. A report into maternity failings at an NHS trust has found the deaths of 201 babies and 9 mothers could have been avoided. Donna Ockendon's review found catastrophic failures at Shrewsbury and Telford. Jessica Clasby-Monk runs the Legacy of Leo website, showing information about baby loss, stillbirth and miscarriage.
You've got 1 or 2 or more parents that have been able to push through that and push for years. And that's exhausting. And I feel for them today because I don't know how they've managed to keep that up. But it should never take that push from people going through this to actually get solid answers. And because of that, other people have got answers that they need.
The Justice Secretary is appealing a decision by the Parole Board to release the mother of baby P. Tracy Connolly has been in prison since 2009 over the death of her 17-month-old son Peter, who suffered months of abuse. The US president has announced another $500 million in direct aid for Ukraine. Joe Biden has already approved more than $13 billion in humanitarian and military assistance for Ukraine throughout the Russian invasion. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 41 points at 75.78. The pound buys $1.31 and €1.17. LBC weather, mostly clear tonight with rain and sleet for southern England and Wales, a low of -5. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Lottie Morley.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. On the panel tonight with me, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, journalist, author and political commentator. Chris Daw, QC, legal commentator and author of Justice on Trial, Radical Solutions for a System at Breaking Point. We'll find out more about that in just a moment. And Giles Kenningham is former head of press for David Cameron, now founder of Trafalgar Strategy. And Luke Tryl is UK director of More in Common. They're here to answer your questions. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 as well, and you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Mick in Leeds. Hello, Mick.
Good evening.
Evening.
Yeah, I'd just like to know, does your panel think that we should prosecute the NHS staff who were involved in the hundreds of unnecessary deaths of the babies at the Shrewsbury Hospital Trust?
Should we prosecute those who were responsible for what happened at the Shrewsbury NHS Trust? Yasmin, as the only woman on the panel tonight, let's come to you first.
I think you'd find it quite difficult to actually find the people you could charge and prosecute, because part of the problem with these hospitals, and we've had a number of these terrible scandals, is the culture. Something happens, I think, in not just hospitals, in police forces and so on, where patterns of behaviour go on and a secrecy sets in. So I think that would be very difficult. But I think we've had so many of these. I think there was one in Cumbria, a hospital in Cumbria, where we had a similar thing happen.
I think it was, wasn't it?
No, it's Furness Hospital.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah. And promises are made, lessons will be learned, and they never are. So I think there's got to be an institutional kind of reckoning more than individual prosecutions.
But what's the point in having these very expensive inquiries if nothing ever happens after them?
Exactly.
I mean, you've got to have them, because otherwise, if you don't have them, nothing ever happens.
Yes.
But
I think you could even threaten closure. I think it's an institutional failure as much as anything else.
But why should it be an institutional failure? Is it because there are people within individual hospital trusts, whether they're administrators, whether they're senior medical people, that just will not accept that what they're doing should be questioned?
Yes, but I also think we have to remember that for a long time there was this absurd fundamentalism, and I speak as a woman who's had 2 children, that you had to have a natural birth, that doctors were cruel interventionists, that medicalised birth, don't ask for any help. I mean, there was Wendy Savage, I remember, in the East End of London, and it was a kind of ideology that nobody could question, and they really demonised doctors. The National Childbirth Trust, and you're going to get a lot of calls about this, and created this thing that the only way to be a proper mother and a happy mother was not to have any intervention. That brought a cultural change.
That's still going on. I interviewed somebody in the last hour, Caroline Flynn, who's written books on this, saying, well, of course, a home birth is the safest birth.
It's
and of course,
not.
I, as a man, think, well, that's ridiculous. But then I think, well, as a man, should I have a view on this?
And, I had epidurals both times. I asked for epidurals, okay, because I knew that they were going to be difficult births. And they said they wouldn't do it till I heard somebody, a caller, until for one of the births, it was too late. It's just this awful ideology. And women were forced to believe it, that you could only be happy if you naturally gave birth, and you were a failure. You were a failure if you didn't. It was awful, and it continues.
Luke and Giles, you've both worked in government. Often government departments think that they can pull levers, but sometimes it takes a long time to do that. How much of this is down to sort of national policy? How much is it down to the individual hospital trust? You'd have to surely say it was more down to the people that worked in the trust.
I think they clearly bear a large part the blame for what happened here. But my question is, what on earth were the inspectorate doing? Why on earth weren't CQC finding these problems earlier? I think only a couple of years before Jeremy Hunt announced the inquiry, CQC rated them good, and I spent a couple of years working at Ofsted, the education inspectorate, and let me tell you, if that had been a school, those issues would have been identified much sooner. So I think that, yes, the individuals involved need to be prosecuted, and I think there'll be real anger if this is another situation where no one actually faces the consequences of this. But at the same time, we need to look, how are we holding these hospitals to account? Because clearly in this case, completely failed.
Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be an honest conversation about the NHS, which politicians in this country are too scared to have. The Tories are scared about it because they see it as a fundamental weakness. Labour, you get into this arms race of spending. There are fundamental issues with it, and no one's willing to shine the light of transparency on it. Look at efficiency, look at the fact that in parts it's incredibly wasteful. I think what COVID did was actually pull the NHS into the 21st century and say, look, you've got to digitalise service if you want a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week NHS. You've got to fundamentally rethink where you're at. And the problem here is, ironically, the people in this country who could have the honest conversation about the NHS are Labour, but they're not going to have it, and the Tories are too scared. They're just in an arms race on this.
I think you're doing Jeremy Hunt a disservice here, because when he first became Health Secretary, there was another one of these incidents. I can't remember which one it was now, but it was a similar situation. And he said, I think almost on his first day in office, he said, look, people should be willing to come forward and blow the whistle. We will listen, and we've got to change the culture. But clearly you can't change a culture in a few years.
No, and I think he was right. But I think there's a fundamental wider issue here, is that the Tories are just in an arms race with Labour about who can spend more money without actually looking about, does it work? Is it accountable? Is there the full force of transparency? And I don't think there is.
Chris?
Yeah, well, I've spent 30 years in the criminal justice system, and I can tell you for sure that that's not the place that you solve these problems. And I just completely disagree with the sentiment that wherever there is a tragedy, there must be a prosecution. I've been involved in many of these very high-profile cases, the Hillsborough disaster, for example, and the legal consequences of that. And the criminal justice system did nothing for anyone in those processes, as those on both sides would no doubt agree. For me, the important thing with any of these major public disasters, particularly where so many people die, as in this case, is that you remove the question of criminal liability, and you also remove the issue of suing government authorities, because the problem is everyone goes into defence mode and no one tells the truth about anything, or no one really reveals what happened. The only way that you get to the bottom of these things is truth and reconciliation without criminal punishment and without liability, because if you put people on trial, they will say nothing and they will defend themselves, and that won't help anyone.
Just to play devil's advocate, if there isn't the ultimate sanction of criminal sanction, then people might feel free to not make the reforms that are needed because they think, well, nobody's going to come after me.
No, well, the people who are responsible for the reforms are not the people that you'd be prosecuting. You'd be prosecuting people who were responsible for individual failures of care, potentially manslaughter or even corporate manslaughter. And those are not the individuals or indeed the institutions who can make widespread reform of process. I mean, the points that Jasmine was making about the appalling way in which women were sort of talked down to and told what kind of childbirth they had to have, none of that's going to come through threats of prosecution. That's going to come through systemic cultural change within the NHS, and the approach to childbirth in particular should be informed consent of every woman who goes through the process, who should be given access to proper levels of care, proper levels of advice, and make her own choices, not be forced into having a childbirth she doesn't want.
Yasmin, who implements this cultural change? Because clearly there needs to be one, not just in maternity services in a particular hospital trust, but I would say much more widely as well.
Well, I think in many, many cases it has been happening. And I really don't buy this idea that because we've had this terrible failure in maternity care in some hospitals, that kind of tells you what's wrong with the National Health Service. It doesn't. The National Health Service has operated in the most extraordinary way, and I'm not just talking about the COVID. But I think what happened with this particular thing, and we do need to look at the particular thing, various forces came together to decide that childbirth had to be natural. And in some ways, these hospitals responded to that pressure from the NCT, from some mums, from some organisations, sometimes from the media. And I think, we all have a responsibility to change that. And it can be done. I mean, I think, child care, health care in hospitals is amazingly better than it used to be. Because children have a choice. They never had a choice before. They're asked about their treatment. So things do change for the better, change.
I think when it comes to childbirth in particular, it's a uniquely personal decision, and there is no right answer for any given woman, and that's where it went wrong. I think all women should have, as I say, the absolute right to choose the childbirth.
So is that part of the problem here, that the system... Okay, you can't translate this nationally maybe, but the system in that particular hospital was not listening to the mother, the mothers to be.
Yes.
And that's where it started to go wrong.
Yes. And there are other hospitals where, in like I said, in the East End of London, Wendy Savage created this whole culture, which is, in my view, incredibly intimidating, and especially Bangladeshi mothers and others who didn't feel powerful, felt they had to just... She didn't even believe in painkillers.
Well, there is also this thing that when we go into hospital, we expect we're being treated by experts, and we don't like to question the experts, maybe. Certainly initially, I certainly had that when my mother was in hospital, and she eventually died, and we just accepted that the doctors knew what they were doing, and it turned out they did not.
No, I mean, that's a cultural issue. I mean, my girlfriend who's sitting outside was in hospital for several weeks with COVID, and it took days and days and days of advocacy and arguing for them to do the test so that she could get the medication that saved her life. And that's with a very kind of vociferous advocate on her behalf, although she was very ill at the time. It was a professional advocate, you could say, but it was a traumatic time because the medical profession, sadly, the NHS doesn't have a culture of listening. They have a culture of telling.
But often by the time you do think you've broken through, it's too late.
Yes, well, of course, it is for many. And as I said, I think the culture in the NHS needs to be open, and it needs to be about listening, and it needs to be patient-led. Because if it's led by what the administrators in particular want to happen, rather than what the patients want and need, which may not exactly accord with what their doctors want them to have, but they need to have the ability to make those choices for themselves. And also, I think families need to be brought into these decisions as well when people are particularly ill, and asked, what do you think he or she would want? And what do you know that might help us treat this person, rather than just being told what to do?
When I look through the texts and tweets that have come in throughout the day on LBC, I mean, I've got another one here, and there've been literally hundreds of these from Jane, who says, I lost our son 36 hours after he was born after an emergency C-section. My husband nearly lost me as well. The hospital was at fault, but we didn't pursue a legal case against them. I also suffered from depression and PTSD afterwards. Now, I mean, childbirth is a risky thing. There will always be things that go wrong. You're never going to get any health system that gets it right 100% of the time. But certainly in this hospital, and you have to hope not in others, that things went very wrong indeed. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's coming up to 8:15.
This is LBC.
I'm
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
17 minutes past 8. We have on our panel tonight Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, the journalist, author and political commentator, Giles Kenningham, former head of press for David Cameron and now the founder of Trafalgar Strategy, and Luke Tryl, UK director of More in Common. Chris, tell us, Chris Daw is here too, Chris Daw QC, I should say, which will be important in our next question. But you've written this book, Justice on Trial, Radical Solutions for a System at Breaking Point. 45-second elevator pitch. I always ask people when they got books.
Well, the book basically tells us that our criminal justice system is completely broken. We criminalise or prohibit drugs, and that leads to massive additional crime and huge harm to drug users. We lock far too many people up in prison, more than anyone else in Western Europe, and that also has a dramatic impact on crime rates. And worst of all, we criminalise children as young as 10 in a so-called civilised country. And those are the main themes of my book and the main reasons why our criminal justice system is broken, as the title suggests.
Right, keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. Our next call is John on the Wirral. Hello, John.
Yes, hello everyone. My question to the panel is, with regards to the release of Tracy Connolly, do you think the prison system and the criminal justice system works?
Now, Tracy Connolly is the mother of baby P. We all remember that case. I can't even remember when it was now. Was it 5, 6, 7 years ago?
More than that. I think it was about 10 years ago, nearly.
It was. It was when Ed Balls was children's minister, wasn't it? So it would be over 10 years. Chris, let's come to you first on this. Do you think the prison system works in the light of the decision to release Tracy Connolly?
Well, I think we gave the game away with my views on the prison system just a couple of minutes ago. This is a classic case of why the prison system doesn't work and why the criminal justice system really doesn't work, is because we have the Justice Secretary immediately going to Parliament and effectively criticising the parole board, who have taken enormous care to make a decision in accordance with the rules that this defendant is suitable for release. And that involves psychiatric and psychological assessment. It involves the review of prison records going back many years, and it involves, I think, 20 separate parole conditions in order to satisfy the parole board that this particular person will be fit for release. So I think there's a problem in that we have this knee-jerk response from politicians every time we have one of these high-profile cases, driven often by media headlines or vice versa. But the general answer to the question is no, we imprison far too many people. The criminal justice system, and the prison system in particular, is a total failure. Those countries which don't use prison anywhere near as much as us have much lower crime rates and, more importantly, much more success at turning people's lives around once they have committed a crime.
Why shouldn't the Justice Secretary have the right to say, well, can you think about this again, please?
He and everyone else has the right to require the parole board to think again, because any of us can bring judicial review proceedings against the parole board.
But we can't because it's so expensive.
Well, that's true. That's a different argument. But in theory, at least, campaign groups or anyone affected, including the government, can apply to the court to have this decision overturned if it's irrational, unreasonable and completely unlawful. So everyone has that right. My problem is that the rush to the microphone or the rush to the dispatch box within minutes, if not even quicker sometimes, of these decisions being publicly announced just cannot reflect proper thought. The Justice Secretary is supposed to have a role in protecting the integrity of the justice system, and rushing to Parliament, probably not having considered any of the documents, any of the underlying reports or any of the issues in any detail, is exactly why politicians get
surely
these
he
wrong.
Also has a role to apply the test of, is this conducive to the public good?
Well, of course he does, but the public good is reflected in the law that applies to decisions on parole. If the government doesn't like the laws, and we know that they're reviewing these rules now, but the remedy is to change the law, not to constantly criticise the parole board for simply doing their job in line with the rules as they currently exist.
He's not criticising the parole board, he's just saying, can you think about this again, please? That doesn't mean to say he's criticising
Well, of course he is. He's saying he thinks the decision is wrong, so that's a direct criticism, and he's effectively suggesting that the decision-making that they've gone through and the decision they've reached is wrong.
They have been wrong in the past, haven't they?
Yes, of course. And all decisions are imperfect.
He is our voice there. And what's the point of having a Justice Secretary? What's the point of having a politician as Justice Secretary if they can't question what the parole board does, given that sometimes the parole board has got it wrong?
I wouldn't have a problem with him questioning the decision if he'd looked at all of the documents, if he'd been given...
You don't know that he hasn't.
Well, he didn't have time. It's impossible for him to have done so. And he didn't refer in any detail to the evidence. He simply looked at the crime itself, considered the public reaction and outrage, which is completely understandable, understandable, and just immediately started to say we've got to try and overturn this decision. What I would have liked to have seen, and we never do see it, of course, particularly from this government, is a considered, calm and reflective approach rather than just a knee-jerk response saying it's wrong.
Giles Kenningham, if you had been a special advisor still, what would have been your advice to Dominic Raab in this situation?
I think my position on this sort of has fundamentally changed. I was very much of a lock 'em up, throw away the key stance until, when I was in government, someone put the stat in front of me that 99% of prisoners end up back on the streets. So we have to look to rehabilitate them. And there has been a fundamental problem with the justice system, is that we, as with many other government departments, we turn over the Justice Secretary far too quickly. But I do think we need to take more of a compassionate approach. I think that, the Chris Grayling stance of banning books for prisoners was completely wrong. I disagree with Chris in the sense there should be the final check and balance there. So I think it's right that, if Dominic Raab wants to challenge this decision, he can, because they have got decisions wrong in the past. But I do think the system is broken, and we do have to take much more of a pragmatic view on this.
Bob, quite rightly, has picked me up on a text. He says his name is Peter Connolly, not Baby P. I mean, Baby P is what we all knew him as, but of course his name then was released. Yasmin?
You see, one of the problems is that politicians, particularly on the right, use this for political purposes, these moments, and that's just plain wrong. But nobody...
Is that what you think Dominic Raab is doing?
Yeah. But what I feel, I am too emotionally involved in the death of this child to have a rational view on it. So part of me wants to bang this mother up forever, because all I see are images that we remember, even from back then. And so I should never be allowed to make a judgment on this. So there's the emotional reaction, and then there's the quite deliberate politicization that comes in the way of, I think, real justice here.
Because Ed Balls was accused of that at the time, wasn't he? Of with his, I'm trying to remember all the details, but there's Sharon Shoesmith, the head of Children's Services at Islington, he politicised it regarding her role in this, didn't he? So it's not just politicians on the right.
No, and he was wrong, and I remember writing a very strong piece. No. I did the wrong thing. I did the emotional thing. I went for her too, I remember now, and then kind of thought that was wrong, because the emotions just kind of build up, don't they?
Well, they do.
He was doing it for political reasons. It was right for her to leave the job, but it was wrong for him to do it in the way he did
his
it.
Powers, didn't he? That's what I think. That's what.
That's the thing, and it was a political thing.
It was Haringey, by the way, not Islington. I'm told. I'm getting two things wrong now. Luke.
There is clearly something wrong with the way that the parole board operates at the moment. I mean, this is just the latest in the series of decisions that would make the average member of the public scratch their heads.
Is that the test, though?
We all remember.
Why does that mean it's wrong?
Because we remember cases like John Warboys, where it was clear that the parole board and the Justice Secretary was involved in helping to do that, which is why it's important that politicians can check these unelected bodies, can ask for them to reconsider, can support judicial reviews. Now, I agree with lots of what people have said about problems with the prison system and the lack of the focus on rehabilitation. But this was a crime which, scandalised the country. We were appalled when we saw those images, as Yasmin said. And I think that does matter. I think those emotions do matter. I don't think you can take it out. The severity of the crime was so great that I think the parole board have made the wrong decision here. And I'm pleased that the Justice Secretary is looking at the parole board as part of a wider review and looking at, for instance, giving victims and their families more of a say over decisions, allowing decisions to be checked and to be held up. I think that's going to make a real difference, and I think it's what the public would expect. And the other thing that I would just say that worries me as well, to go back to our earlier discussion about the NHS, is I'm worried that lots of the problems which led to the death of Peter Connolly in our children's services still haven't been addressed. I think there's been chronic underfunding of children's services for very many years, and I don't think we'd find ourselves, unfortunately, very unfortunately, surprised if something similar happened again. So if we're talking about reviewing systems, I think children's services are one we really need to look at.
Do you think widening this out a bit into the justice system as a whole, do you think part of the problem is that we have far too many justice secretaries? I don't know how many there have been over the past 10 years, but a hell of a lot. And you get one who comes in with a reforming agenda, particularly for prisons, and there have been a couple of those over the past few years. Michael Gove being one. And then they're gone within a year, and then their successor comes in and completely reverses.
Well, the position is that the Justice Department was cut more than any other department under the austerity round in 2010 and onwards by 40%. It's the forgotten department. No one really sees it as a particularly attractive job. There's really no winners in the Justice Secretary, and so you get people who are either they've already done a big job and they end up as Justice Secretary, like Dominic Raab, or you just have people that are on their way to something else. So I'm afraid it's just a stopping off point, and that just reflects our complete lack of interest as a society in a functioning justice system. It's not an interesting political topic. See, people don't vote for it.
It's fascinating.
Well, it might be, but not politically. We had Boris Johnson and Priti Patel at the last election saying, let's increase all the sentences, lock people up for longer, and people love that. They love that, the emotional reaction to those kind of lock them up kind of sound bites that you get at elections. The problem is none of it reflects the evidence about what works.
No.
And the cost is huge, right? I remember dealing with troubled families in government. They identified these 120,000 troubled families. They said the cost of reacting to them was £9 billion a year. It's actually, if you actually solve the problems first. So it is back to front. You're right, there are too many justice secretaries, like there's been too many health secretaries. You speak to most cabinet ministers, they say, ironically, they need 2 years to get into the job to actually get across it. So before they even got across it, they're being moved on and there's no continuity.
And that's where the so-called blob comes in, doesn't it? Sort of people who know that you've got a here today, gone tomorrow cabinet minister, and therefore they know that, well, just bide your time. Say, yes, minister, we'll do that. Put it in the pending tray, and then, of course, they get a new Justice Secretary or Transport Secretary or whoever who can just sort of come in with their own agenda, but they'll be gone within a few years. I mean, just on prisons, though, because I do a lot on prison reform because I don't understand why it is that successive governments believe that the more people you put in prison, the safer the country is. Now,
I don't think they do believe that, Ian. They don't. It's just that people vote for that.
Why wouldn't the numbers go up all the time?
It's not why they put those policies forward. They put them forward because the public vote for them. And no party that stood for election on the premise of emptying prisons would ever win. So it's a purely political approach.
Nobody wants to empty prisons, but surely if you explain that, fine, lock people up who are a danger to others, everyone's going to agree with that. I don't think there's...
That's only about 20% of the prison population.
Yeah, exactly. So therefore, you can find other ways of punishing the rest. I think that's an eminently saleable position to the general public.
I'm afraid I disagree with you. Having written a book about this and travelled all over the world and spoke to politicians and judges, the one theme that comes back from all of them is, unless I'm tough in terms of heavy sentencing, I won't win an election.
Sometimes, Luke, politicians have to lead public opinion rather than follow it, don't they?
They absolutely have to lead public opinion, but the flip side of that is that these debates so often come down to, aren't the public terrible for wanting longer sentences? They're just wrong. We need to educate them differently. What you don't see from campaigns, you see campaigners having these rows in Westminster, criticising Tory politicians. You don't have them actually going out and making the case to the public, trying to change minds. That's the way that you'll get politicians to change their mind, if the public change their minds as well. And the problem is, you can't say to victims of crime, I'm very sorry, but actually we're not going to punish this person. In London, you're lucky if anyone gets punished for a crime.
Why is punishment a good thing? Surely the criminal justice system should be about reducing crime and reducing the number of victims, not about punishing people for the sake of it.
It's got to be partly about punishing.
Why?
Well, surely.
Who says?
Well, because otherwise, what incentive is there for people not to do wrong?
Because the whole system that's premised on punishment, which we end up in the United States with 2.5 million people in prison, tens of thousands of them serving life without parole. Does anyone think that blind obsession with lengthy sentences is doing anybody any good?
That, but there are some people.
Well, many people are.
There are some
all
people
the time
who are just plain evil that cannot be rehabilitated.
You've mentioned those. The tiny number, that's maybe that in that category you've just mentioned, if you choose to use the word evil.
I'm glad you admit somebody should go to prison.
No, I agree with you, and I agree with the premise that there are a small number of people who are dangerous to society and cannot be trusted to be out in the streets with the rest of us. But most people in prison are just care leavers, drug addicts, those with serious mental health conditions, so they don't belong there.
Pregnant mothers. pregnant mothers. Why are we putting them into prison?
Well, because if they commit a serious crime...
No, they didn't commit a serious crime. Many of them did not commit a serious... or they're no danger to the public.
Well, they're in for drugs offences, they're in for breaching court orders.
Shoplifting often. It's ridiculous. I remember going to a prison once because they wanted to talk about whatever I was writing about. I think it was I can't remember, Bedfordshire. And there were dead plants in tins, baked bean tins, all dead, which was really striking. I said, what happened to these plants? Michael Howard came one day and he thought the prisoners were being spoilt by having the right to grow flowers, so he ordered them all to be killed. I mean, what kind of a man does that? Come on.
You're finding out why he didn't win the 2005 election.
But that's obviously wrong. It's obviously wrong to be imprisoning people who shouldn't be imprisoned. But actually, we do need punishment. We do need deterrence. We know that that's how orderly societies run.
No, we don't.
Well, we do. We know from a very early age, you do wrong, you get a punishment. But that's a core tenet of our society.
Yeah, but it doesn't work. It doesn't actually achieve its end.
So we have some anarchic society where there are no consequences for your actions.
No, I've not said that at all. It's not a question of no consequences. It's about having a system, as they do in many European countries, first of all, where you don't criminalise young children and basically brand them as criminals for life, and secondly, where you don't just put them into a prison where they can just become more criminalised the longer they're there. And that's what we do.
We spend the rest of this programme talking about this, and one day we will, but not today. It's 8:33. Let's get the news headlines on LBC with Lottie Morley.
Changes to maternity services are expected in England after a report revealed catastrophic failures at NHS trusts in Shrewsbury and Telford. The errors led to the deaths of more than 200 babies and 9 mothers over 20 years. The Justice Secretary will ask the Parole Board to reconsider its recommendation for baby P's mother to be released from prison. Tracy Connolly was jailed in 2009 after her 1-year-old son Peter suffered more than 50 injuries before he died. And Bruce Willis has announced he'll be stepping away from acting because of health issues. He's been diagnosed with aphasia, which can impact your ability to communicate. LBC weather, mostly clear tonight with rain and sleet for southern England and Wales, a low of -5.
This is LBC.
What would
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:37 on LBC. With me on the panel tonight are Chris Daw QC, Giles Kenningham, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and Luke Tryl. Now, Luke, you are UK Director of More in Common. What is that? Because a lot of people think it's some sort of Remainer front organisation, but it's nothing to do with it, is it?
Absolutely not. No. We are an organisation that thinks you can have very vigorous disagreements, like we just had on this panel, but the way we have those disagreements matters, and we can do it in a way which says, Chris and I disagree on some elements of the criminal justice system, but we don't think we're bad people as a result. So we spend a lot of time trying to help understand people's different views and trying to show that just because you disagree on an issue doesn't mean that you're a bad person, and trying to bridge some of those divides. Because, if you look at somewhere like the US, unfortunately, we probably couldn't have this same debate and stay civil to each other at the end. So our mission is to stop us going down that path.
Hashtag group hug. Right, let's go to our next question. It's a text question from Julie in Cheshunt. Just the night before Jamie Wallace MP came out as trans so bravely, his party leader Boris Johnson was making snide jokes about trans issues. Is this government serious about trans rights? Just to explain, there was a dinner for Tory MPs last night and Boris Johnson gave a speech, and he began his speech by saying this: "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," or as Keir Starmer would put it, people who are assigned female or male at birth. Luke, first of all, just give us a comment on your views on what Jamie Wallace said. I mean, it's a 3 a.m. tweeted statement that he put out last night.
It was an incredibly brave, powerful statement, which talked both about his journey of coming to terms with his gender identity, but also some of the horrific experiences which he's been subject to in recent years. I mean, I have huge admiration for him for doing it, and I also think it was a really powerful reminder that behind sometimes these very heated, abstract debates we have about, genitalia and sports, actually there are real people behind this stuff, people like Jamie, and I think it's really important that we start to focus on the people rather than some of these philosophical debates.
Chris?
I mean, I think if you speak to anyone under the age of 25, they can't believe that we're still in an age where it's so difficult for someone like this to be able to just be who they are and express who they are. I've had this conversation, where these sort of multi-generational conversations where you have anyone who's sort of maybe over 40 or 50 is kind of, has real problems with terminology and would make the sorts of inappropriate remarks that Boris Johnson did. Whereas, as I say, young people just entirely take it for granted that most young people anyway, that you just accept people for who they are. And if that were to happen, then sadly, people who are in this position of this utter torment for so much of their life wouldn't have to suffer in the way that they do. But incredibly brave thing to do, and good for him. And I hope he gets the support, within the party and elsewhere that he needs.
And he does seem to, he says in his statement about the support he's had from government whips, who are not necessarily always the most progressive of people.
No, but I think there is much more of an understanding now of the need to be measured and to give proper support to people who are going through this.
I mean, this line that Boris Johnson gave yesterday, it wasn't an anti-trans line. He was poking fun at Keir Starmer, who couldn't seem to define what a woman was. Now, sometimes you can say, well, even asking that question is a bit gratuitous. But Wes Streeting today, I think, gave a very good answer, and it's interesting that he can, but his party leader can't.
Yeah, well, we unfortunately, this issue, once again, coming back to some of the points that Luke made earlier, it's so polarising. There are often really extreme views from those who know very little about the subject and have never been on the journey. And I just think, as a society, we just need to accept people for who they are and let people live their lives without any of this sort of judgment and vociferous opinion about the use of language and terminology and gender pronouns. What does it matter to you what someone else wants to use as their gender pronoun or how they want to be addressed? Just let them make their own choices, as you'd expect for yourself.
Yasmin?
It's not as easy as that, Chris. I mean, I think one has to remember how in when you wanted to be a politician, to say you were gay and entering politics was a very brave thing to do.
Didn't do me any good, did it?
Didn't do you any good. Now, of course, it'd be... So these things happen progressively. And I think I'm absolutely with you that trans people should be absolutely treated as fairly and equally where the issues are boiling at the moment, it's very hard because there are good women, kind women, who have real concerns about the fact that they are women. And why do I have to say, if I was trans, why do I have to say I am a woman in order to be treated equally? So these are important debates. And I'm not putting any position out because it's too scary. So I don't want to enter that fight. So there is a
That's
whole
a problem
thing.
in itself, isn't it? In
There
that
is.
I can feel you choosing your words very carefully.
You have
and
to.
I feel exactly the same, that both extremes of this argument are basically stifling any kind of discussion about it because people are scared to enter the debate.
Which is where Keir Starmer ended up, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, but I mean, there goes in the point. I mean, so what? It's another conversation about why he's not a good leader because he can't make a decision. But I do think, coming back to this point about Jamie Watts, that it was a very brave and personal thing to do. But also, I do think it's been quite encouraging. There has been a movement of MPs to be a lot more candid, and I think public sentiment has shifted where they can talk about their mental health, they can talk about things like this, they can talk about personal issues they have in their lives, and they're not stigmatised. And after all, they're on a platform, so it's good that we've moved that way, so we should see it as a positive thing. But yes, we are in a situation where people are being a bit tortured over the language, where we just can't have a candid conversation, and that's where Starmer was. He's worried about offending someone, so we didn't actually get a clear position.
It's not just language, though. It is they're genuine questions about women's spaces and safety and all kinds of things. And I would love to have a proper debate on it. But when people who speak out as women then get really kind of slaughtered in the public space, makes it very hard. And often it's not trans people who are doing it. People who are content,
Does that, I mean, I don't think I can even describe it as a joke that Boris Johnson opened his speech by saying, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," or as Keir Starmer would put it, people who are assigned female or male at birth. Now, I don't think that many trans people would be offended by that, would they? Or do you think they would?
Well, they might, but I think what a silly, stupid way to start a speech. Why would you do that?
Who wrote that, I wonder? I mean,
why would you do that?
Ridiculous.
Yeah, why would you do
Does
that?
anyone write speeches for Boris Johnson that he sticks to? I'm not sure they do.
But then I will also say, in defence of the Prime Minister, you have to judge people.
Why are you defending this Prime Minister?
Well, no. There are lots of things. There are lots of things. There are lots of things that it's difficult to defend him on. But actually, when it comes to issues around, gender identity, around sexual orientation when he was Mayor of London, his instincts are quite progressive. And I think on this, he is struggling, like lots of us are, to find, what the right middle ground that balances, as you've talked about, Yasmin, different types of rights. What is reassuring is, as you can imagine, this is one of the issues that in trying to find common ground, we've spent a bit of time looking at, is just how different the public debate on gender identity issues and trans is from what happens on Twitter or what happens, dare I say it, in the media, is that people, they talk about their own experiences of having trans colleagues, of knowing someone's kid who ended up being trans, and that's how they view it. They don't get into these debates about, what counts a woman, what doesn't. They probably, they often have quite a hard red line on issues around sports, and fairness there. But for the most part, they want people, as you said, Yasmin, to be treated with compassion, with acceptance, and they accept, as we've said in, Jamie's case, how difficult it is for so many people.
Just finally on this, a lot of trans people are very concerned, or trans allies are very concerned that, for example, the Times newspaper every single day has a vaguely anti-trans story. And they must do that for a reason. I'm not sure I can define what that reason is. But you can understand why people feel got at. If they imagine that there are these hordes of women with male genitalia breaking into changing rooms. I mean, it's just not the case. I remember when I had Kathleen Stock on, the academic who lost her job, I said, well, how many cases were there? And say in the last 5 years, she hadn't got a clue. The answer was 2. Now, OK, you can be concerned about each individual case, but a lot of people are running away with the impression that this is a major issue, and it just is not.
Well, I think the answer to your question about why you have media coverage which causes controversy around this is because, as I said earlier, there is a generation, or more than one generation, of mostly older people who are violently opposed to these reframing of genders and the language that goes with it. I've sat around dinner tables and I've listened to sort of middle-aged or older people just spending hours talking about why we can't describe someone as they and them, even though that may be their personal choice. Whereas when I speak to my teenage daughter, for example, it's completely accepted and normal. So I think it's just a generational divide, but the Times readers are not my daughter's generation.
I think you should stop being so horrible to and about old people. I'm a very old people. And I'm a very open-minded old people.
Well, I'm sure you are. And I'm not saying there are not lots of older people who are open-minded as well.
Chris, honestly.
I actually do think, and from the conversations we've had with people, it's about old people being transphobic. It's actually born out of not understanding the issues, which is, again, why I don't think the current debate, which has bad faith actors on both sides of this debate, is actually really helping. Actually, the vast majority of people want sensible, evidence-based solutions which help to resolve quite knotty issues.
But as a feminist, there is an issue that is very difficult, and feminists I absolutely worship have got into very serious trouble talking about the fact that we should be able to say we are women and be trusted to honour and keep safe and fight for trans rights. That's the thing I want to be able to say.
Chris, I'm going to move on because we're running a little bit late and I want to get in a couple of questions before the end. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:48.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister and, of course, former Chancellor of the Exchequer. The reaction to last week's spring statement has been universally condemning, even from some church people as well. Do you think Rishi Sunak was misguided, was out of touch, or just chose not to listen?
I don't think he understands what's happening. There is hardship and they don't hear. There is suffering and they don't see. There's pain and they walk on by. And we've now got a safety net that is so threadbare, that is full of holes, and it's being ripped apart stitch by stitch.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:51, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, Chris Daw QC, Giles Kenningham and Luke Tryl with me answering your questions. Alex is in Watford. Alex, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, Ian and the panel. As a Thatcherite, why can I not believe Boris Johnson? Is he the correct leader for the country?
Giles?
I think, Alex, the jury's still out on this. Obviously, you've got Partygate investigation ongoing. I think if it does transpire that Boris is going to face a fine, lawmakers can't be rule breakers and he has to go. He's been given a reprieve, partly because of the war in Ukraine. But yeah, I think at the moment the jury's still out. But I think if he is found to have been hit by a fine, unequivocally he must go.
Even though we won't have seen Sue Gray's full report by then, do you not think that judgment has to be left until we've seen that full report?
Well, I mean, this will be the police who'd have done, who would have launched a full investigation. They're operationally independent from the government. And so, if the Prime Minister's above the law, what does it say to the rest of the country? And if, and I say if it's the case, it's happened, obviously happened at an incredibly difficult and sensitive time for the country. And we are kind of in this situation where, at some point we have to respect the sanctity of office. We have to respect the rule of law. You've seen this government, in some instances, which is right, sort of challenge the status quo and tear down institutions. But quite frankly, if he has, he should go.
None of this would obviously have happened in David Cameron's day. I mean, you've worked in Downing Street. You probably have a bit of a better understanding of the way people work there. Did you have any sympathy at all with any of these gatherings taking place?
I mean, I think, obviously Number 10 is a pressure cooker. It's very difficult. There is this obviously argument that the blurring between an office and a home, makes this more difficult. But what I would say about David Cameron was that he respected the office of the Prime Minister and realised he was a temporary holder of that. And I think anyone who sits in these positions needs to remember that. And if they don't, then basically you are fundamentally undermining the democracy we live in, which is what you saw we got very close to a situation with Trump, where, we may have had a situation where the Secret Services had to take him out of office.
Chris?
We had a bumbling, dishonest buffoon standing at a podium, looking down a camera lens, telling every single one of us as we stayed in our homes and we followed the rules, stay at home at the very time and on the same day as he was hanging out with other people, drinking alcohol, including his wife, including people who were clearly not working, breaking every single rule that he himself was lecturing us all to follow. We can't have blazing hypocrisy in Number 10. He should have gone years ago and he should never have been there in the first place. Let's not forget that if he doesn't like a fine, if he's giving one, he can challenge it in court. He can take it to court and see whether he can actually get away with it in court. But I have to say that the history of this Prime Minister, when he was Mayor of London and throughout his career, has been to lie and lie and lie again, and we can't have liars at the heart of our government.
But can you tell us what you really think?
I'll give it a go.
Luke?
It depends which Boris Johnson you're talking about. Is it the Boris Johnson who has stepped up and actually, sort of shamed European countries into taking greater action in Ukraine, has made us, certainly in Ukraine, he's the most popular leader in the Western world, someone who actually managed to connect with a whole series of voters who felt totally neglected and let down by successive governments.
They still do.
Is that Boris? Well, no, but there's that Boris Johnson who clearly tapped into something and inspired people. And then there's the Boris Johnson who broke the rules, who, people often say in focus groups, he just can't help himself, can he? That Boris Johnson. And so for that reason, I actually agree with Giles. I think the jury's out. I think if he faces a fine, it's very difficult for him to stay on, not just because of his personal role, but also because of the
Yasmin, I'm going to ask you to be reasonably brief because I want to fit in another question if you can contain yourself.
I want to have a go.
Go on then, go on.
I want to have a go. It isn't just about the parties. The man, and I'm amazed that you're still remembering the mayor that he was. That was a different person. The man who welcomed immigrants. That's not the Boris. Boris changes as fast as the British weather does. The party is the least of the things that... It is exactly what Giles said. The undermining of the great thing that is the British Parliament. The thing I love about it. The fact that there were rules about you don't lie in the House. And he lies over and over again. He has destroyed one of the pillars of this country. I cannot believe that people still think he's adorable because he cracks a joke and he looks dishevelled and he, come on.
Who else is there?
That's a different question. And there are other people.
Sajid Javid, for a start, who's at least competent.
Jeremy Hunt, I think Jeremy Hunt has shown his real seriousness in the last few weeks about how a leader should behave.
Has he got your support? That's a kiss.
I'm not a Tory. I've loathed a lot of them, but he has really behaved well.
Right, final question from Alan in Edinburgh. Hello, Alan.
Hi, Ian. My question, quite simple. Is it time to end Prime Minister's questions?
Right, 45 seconds from each of you. Is it time to end Prime Minister's questions? Luke?
No. It's slightly ridiculous. It's over the top. MPs behave badly. But it's also the envy of the world. Whenever you speak to a politician from the US, they're like, oh my God, you do that? Every week your Prime Minister has to come and answer questions. And I think it'd be really sad to lose that.
Yasmin?
We should clean it up and remember that you're not allowed to lie during these sessions. And now that everybody's lying, there are too many people lying, it has completely devalued it.
Chris?
No, I agree that we should keep it because there's such little and low levels of interest in parliamentary discourse in our country as it is. And if we got rid of the one bit of it that people actually might occasionally watch, I think that would be a bad thing. But I think I agree with the point that's been made. The Speaker should be absolutely rigorous to prevent dishonesty at the dispatch box, and that just doesn't happen.
Charles? I mean, you, of course, were preparing David Cameron for PM.
And actually, it's the one thing where you see PMs get really, really nervous, which is a good thing, which shows you the level of importance. Absolutely keep it. In the era of fake news, the fragmentation of the media, it is the one lion's den where politicians are held to account in an arena which can't be filtered. Is there too much Punch and Judy? Absolutely. But, no system's perfect.
Except cross-question, obviously. Now, final text question from Teresa in Chesterfield. A NASA astronaut got back to Earth today after almost a year on the International Space Station. Must be quite boring up there. If we sent your panel up into space, what would they need to take to keep themselves busy in the evenings and keep it clean, if you would, Yasmin?
Pack of cards, I guess.
I do love a card game.
For a whole year.
No, you can actually play cards for every evening, I find.
Yeah.
Luke?
I think it'd have to be something terrible like Netflix subscription.
You stop my answer. I'll say Netflix and Amazon Prime. It has to be.
But if I've got a whole year, I'll take the complete works of Shakespeare and actually read them.
Oh, no, I don't think I could get through those. No, too stodgy. Right, thank you very much indeed for being on the show tonight. Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, Chris Daw, Giles Kenningham and Luke Tryl. In just a moment, we're going to be talking about Jamie Wallace, the MP who came out as trans today. I want to know, what are the challenges of living life in this country as a trans person? Do you feel that you can be open about it? Do you feel that you have any understanding at all from your friends, your family, your local community? I just want to know, what is it like? And do you admire this MP for actually being open about it? Because I don't think in this country there has ever been a politician or a national politician who's come out as trans. There has been in New Zealand and one or two other countries, but not here. So we'll take your calls on that in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The Health Secretary says no date has been set